أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of Allah, most beneficial, most merciful. رب اشرح لي صدري. O Allah, expand my chest. ويسر لي أمري, and ease my task. واحلل عقدة من لساني, and loosen any knots on my tongue. يفقه قولي. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. So that they may understand my speech. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. Welcome to Muslims Connected webinar with the title, How to Talk to Your Child About Sex, an Age by Age Guide by educational psychologist Nabila Gangat, who I will introduce shortly. Firstly, I'd like to apologize on behalf of the founder of Muslims Connected, Masood Hayat, and his wife, Wasfia, who are currently on travel. My name is Yasin Solomon, and I will be your facilitator for today's program. So Muslims Connected is an online education platform. We have courses in languages, Spanish, Turkish, and Arabic. We also have some other courses on the basics of Islam, such as how to make salah, hajj, etc. And we also have monthly webinars on important topics such as this one. So allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker. Nabila Gangat is an educational psychologist with a special interest in children's mental health. She believes in addressing emotional issues early to prevent children from carrying them into adulthood and developing mental health concerns. Nabila aims to destigmatize mental illness and seeking mental health services in Muslim communities. Without further ado, I welcome and hand over to educational psychologist Nabila Gangat.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran for that introduction. I don't know if you can hear me. Your signal is not great on your side, but I think from my side it should be fine. Once I start my presentation, if maybe someone can just pop in the chat that they can hear me and the sound is clear and the presentation screen is shown correctly, I think that would be useful.
So I'm sorry, just a second. So allow you to share screen. Okay.
Yep, I think it's good to go. Okay, so
sorry, just a second.
Around.
Okay.
Is everything, let me just see. Yes, you can see and hear. Perfect. Shukran. Thanks for that, Abdul Kabir. Yeah, so I think today's topic, and when sort of suggested we do another seminar, I was quite interested, and I thought I think we talk about something that's super important that not many parents find comfortable to talk with their kids. So tonight, my presentation, the slide I will share that with Masood afterwards, so he can share that, and these exact slides will be sent along to you. So if you don't know something or you're not familiar with something, or if something is not 100% clear, you will have access to the slides afterwards. I like to keep it as simple as possible, but I think some of it is quite dense. I try to keep it simple so that it's easy to understand. And without further ado, I think we can begin. Okay, so that's the welcome. Who am I? I think that was nicely introduced. I find that in the Muslim community, we often shy away from these really, really difficult topics. And I think more discussion. I also think that kids are curious by nature and we have to give them the correct answers. We also media or even from friends and peers at school who do talk about these issues. So I would prefer that the first point of call with this kind of information, for example, even just the word sex, if a child hears it from the reasoning and rationale behind that as we go along. The very first thing or the reason for discussion, which I will elaborate on, is remember that the family is the first place where children first love or first learn to love and care for themselves and others. Children also absorb spoken and unspoken messages from birth about sexuality and growing up. And I feel that if parents are not familiar or comfortable with talking about these things to their children, I find that Google is a place to children, or to anyone for that matter, where children find these resources, or they find porn websites by type in what is sex, and they send to all these links that I feel is really harmful and dangerous. So I would prefer that parents control that. These influence the kind of adolescents and adults that your children become and the choices they later make in life. So this kind of discussion is something that needs to begin very early on in life, but it's not a one-hit wonder, for example, where you sit with your teenage daughter or you sit with your teenage son and you have a big discussion about the birds and the bees. It's a build-up through different mediums along the child's life where we get this going. Oh yeah, my connection is a bit shaky. I just saw that now in the chat. I'm just going to change my Wi-Fi connection. I'll continue shortly. That should be better. Yeah, if it's still a bit shaky, the internet connection, please just pop a message in the chat and I'll try to resolve that. Okay, so that's the second slide for reason for discussion. Just as you help, for example, your child's healthy growth and development in all other ways, parents need to consciously support the development of your child's sexuality and sex education. The one part that I want to sort of veer away, and maybe it seems like I am copping out, I just feel like it's a whole another discussion on its own, and I know that there might be lots of questions, is I'm not going to talk about, for example, sexual orientation. I'm not going to talk about kids who are now questioning their gender or sexuality. This is not the reason for discussion. And I feel that if I added that in, we'd be sitting here for a lot longer. So the reason why I also think parents need to think about their child's sexuality and sex education is, remember, children need to have and develop a positive attitude towards themselves and others. And these are very important values and skills that they need in order to have healthy relationships with themselves and others in the future, which I see a lot of issues in my private practice in therapy. One of the questions that very popularly when I encourage parents to talk about sex, because sometimes parents get a call, for example, from school, oh, your child has been asking about sex at school, or they wrote something funny in their book, or they wrote a letter to their girlfriend or boyfriend at school, and we're talking about 7 or 8-year-olds. It's because these kind of issues have not been discussed, and they hear these words, they think it's a funny word, they like to repeat it, but they have no knowledge or understanding. And I think that you need to start the discussion way earlier than that, which I will share shortly. So many parents ask me that, won't children become more curious and more sexually active, or feel like they need to engage in sex in an earlier way or manner than normal if we talk to children too early about sex, sexuality, and relationships? And I disagree. Research has shown that, and not just myself, but research has shown that young people whose parents have discussed all aspects of sexuality with them tend to delay experimenting, and they also are not extra curious in, for example, pornography, compared to children's parents who do not discuss the issue. So I do think it's important that you earn their trust and invest in your child's relationship, where you bring it up before they ask about it or they become curious. So the overview of discussion of what I will run through this evening is, when is the best time to raise the topic of sex education with your child, how to start the conversation, how to appropriately respond to their questions, and how properly addressing sex will impact children and provide a balanced understanding in their lives and in the future, inshallah. So what is the difference between sex and sexuality? And this is just, this clears up exactly where I'm heading towards for this presentation. Is people use the word sex to describe a male or female and also refer to sexual contact or activity in this manner. Sexuality is much broader, and it is to do with how we feel about and express ourselves, how we form relationships with the people in our lives, and how we are in society, how we present ourselves. Recently, children are super exposed to topics around being gender neutral, whether they binary, sort of binary, where you get people that now don't sort of identifies either male or female, sexual identity, sexual preferences. So it's very common now to hear about gay and lesbian couples or people. And this is not covered in this presentation due to its vast nature. Maybe at some point, inshallah, we can talk about that from an Islamic perspective and figure out how we deal with that, which is prevalent in our society and community. We shouldn't believe or think that Islam says it's wrong and therefore it doesn't exist. It does exist, and there are ways that we have to learn how to deal with that, but that's not in this presentation. So when is the best time to raise the topic of sex with your child? I would always say start early. So parents should begin discussing sex, not just sexual intercourse early, but maturation, for example, body parts, for example, how bodies change through puberty. And children will always be curious about sex, and it usually begins at a very early age. So even children as young as a year, 2 years old will ask you questions, well, as soon as they're verbal, 2 years old. Where do babies come from? How is a baby made? Why is, if you, for example, if they're expecting a sibling to come along, how did the baby live in mommy's tummy? Where does the baby come out of? All of these questions. And that's their generally curious nature, which we need to talk about honestly and give them enough information and pitch it at their age level without telling them some lie story that might distort their view on where exactly babies come from or how babies are made. And I'll try and give you the exact wording to use if you find you might be struggling to answer these very, very difficult questions. I always find that the better parents handle these early interactions, the easier it will be to have more challenging discussions in the future. If you think of the way you parent your children, especially with regard to what they're surrounded by with online social media or just even access to the internet, you have to have an honest, open relationship with your children. Otherwise, they will resort to having distorted and their perspective or perceptions are just not aligned correctly. I also find that children who have discussed sex with their parents at an early age will be more comfortable to approach parents with questions and dilemmas in the future, which is exactly where you want your child to be in the future with you, that kind of relationship. So how to start the conversation? You need to put yourself in a position in a genuine way where you're available. Children will immediately know if you're unavailable or you're not available. So parents should let their children know that in both words and actions, they are available to answer their children's questions. And this is where the genuine feeling is something that you cannot fake. You have to be real about it. And you have to know, and your child will know at a very young age. If I tell mommy this, mommy's going to shout at me. If I tell daddy this or ask daddy, daddy's going to shout at me. That's not the kind of attitude or kind of relationship or bond you want to have with your child. It's much easier, for example, for the child to feel, if I tell mommy I did something wrong, mommy's still going to listen to me and love me. If I tell something to daddy and it's not okay, he's still going to be available and he's not going to shout at me or be upset with me. That's the kind of bond that we aim for. With sex in particular, you need to treat the topic in quite a matter-of-fact way, but respectfully. So it's not like we're being very promiscuous or talking openly about it. When you start the conversation, you can explain to children that these are private conversations that you can only have with certain people. And I would start off with very young children and even children in your home, maybe a mom and a dad, and that's where it begins and ends. You don't have these conversations with random people, and it's not an outside conversation to have. You can teach children how important privacy is when we talk about these things. But as parents and as a family, you have to be comfortable talking about it with your children, because this is where they will be more likely to approach you in later years. You also need to check your comfort level as parents. So children are very perceptive, and they will pick up if parents are uncomfortable and are therefore less likely to be approached or to approach you in the future, which is something we obviously don't want. The next part is quite or very important, is don't wait until children ask about sex. And I think the timing is you need to check the emotional level of your child and also check where they're at. I'll give you age by age in terms of what you start and how you start discussing, or you lay the foundation before you actually have a discussion about sex where you use the word or the actual word. But you need to start building up early. So don't wait until children ask about sex. I find generally before 8 years of age, and that does sound shocking, especially when we think of how we were brought up and maybe parents themselves thinking about their own interactions with the actual word. We live in a different world. We have to parent differently. That's just the way it is. You should be the one to initiate this discussion. So it's not something that's a taboo subject, but it's not something that's openly discussed as well, where you don't go around to family, friends, or functions and you talk about this at the dinner table. It's not okay that way, but it's something that you talk about in the privacy of your home. Children will obviously feel more comfortable bringing up the topic in the future if the parent had initiated it earlier on without them specifically asking about it. I also feel that parents should think of everyday opportunities to discuss sex. And this is not in a bad way, but like, for example, when there's an 8-year-old and there's a siblings diaper that's being changed, you can talk about how maybe males and females have different genitalia, for example. The birth of a sibling, to talk about what happens in mommy's tummy and where does the baby come from. Also noticing the child's own body during puberty is a point where maybe you can discuss or talk about this also. The very, very important thing, and this is where I thought it was important to add this on before I go to the age by age discussion in terms of what we tell children at different ages, is you have to feel and know your values and beliefs as a family well. So I'm not talking about religion. Religion is a much broader subject that I think, inshallah, I mean, we all will think about in a very different way. But Islamically, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your values and beliefs in terms of what do you as a couple, meaning husband and wife, if you're a single mom or single dad, what do you as a family with your extended family and your immediate siblings, or mom, dad, grandparents, what do you guys and what do you feel and believe? You have to have those values and beliefs pinned down exactly. This is okay, this is not okay. So before you start talking to your child about sex, you first need to understand your family values. And these are very important pillars in this discussion because they are the core pillars in what behaviors you as a family are able to accept. Yes, some of it will be guided by Islamic values, and that's something as a family you'll have to discuss and think about and have it clearly understood before you start this conversation. So on the next slide are some very important questions, and they're just a few. I didn't want to add too many for you to think about in terms of your individual family and values when it comes to children in particular with this particular topic and conversation. For example, how do you model these values in your everyday life? So we're looking at honesty, respect, empathy, responsibility, and accountability. What are these values and how do you model them to your child? Does your child know and understand how you feel about these values? So how does your child feel about how do you feel about your child telling a white lie, for example? How do you feel about your child telling somebody or treating somebody in a disrespectful manner? These are very, very important things that you and your child and your family need to think about. Does your child know how you expect them to act when they know and understand your own family values? But your child will only be guided in terms of what you, for example, have and understand as a family first. So your values and beliefs as a family is, have you talked about your values around sexuality as a family? So, for example, who is the appropriate person? Would the mom take the lead and then the dad join in? Would the dad take the lead and the mom join in? If you're a single mom or dad, I have a comment or question at the end of this presentation where I think that, yes, your job is a little bit harder, but actually your job is also easier. And I'll talk about that later. But you need to think about this together to decide what you as a couple or as a family decide to do. So this does not mean that you never speak about sex as a family. It's just laying down the foundational groundwork in terms of what's accepted and what's okay. Could your child tell you what your family values are if you ask them? And these are important things to think about and maybe do with your child in the next couple of days. Ask them, how does mom or dad, or how do I feel about you lying? How do I feel about you not telling the truth? In a very calm way, and it doesn't mean they did anything wrong. Just ask them about these things. Does your child know your values around friendships, TV shows, in movies, boundaries, and online behavior? These are very, very important things when it comes to sex because they're bombarded with us in all these instances. So friendships, do your kids know how you expect them to treat their friends treat them? Are sleepovers allowed? Are they allowed to be alone with friends at their homes? If their parents are unavailable and there's a mom or dad alone with your kids, would you be comfortable with that? You need to know all of these things well. Children will be exposed to this. TV shows and movies, which type of TV shows or movies are appropriate? Boundaries, do your children know how you feel about hugging, kissing family and friends? Do your kids know what is appropriate to post on social media, Snapchat, Twitter? Recently, teens are using lots of Finsta, which is a fake Instagram to appease parents. So they will give you access to their Finsta and they have a secret Instagram because they know that you check their online presence, but the Finsta is something that they will show you to appease you, and then the actual Instagram is hidden and you don't have access to that. So these are things you have to be wary of, understand them well, and invest in your time with your child to be able to understand what's going on with your child. We're going to start now with an age-by-age guide for parents and how you approach this. So parents need to obviously, like I said earlier, be proactive in bringing up a topic as difficult as this. You need to also assess your child's emotional readiness to absorb information in a meaningful manner. You need to be confident in your approach and know that it would be best if your child hears about sex from you first compared to doing a Google search. Out of curiosity, I've done a Google search and you'd be shocked to see what you see. I would say maybe try it, and it will maybe give you a little bit of bravery and confidence to feel that I need to now take the leap and start discussing this. And remember, it's never too late. So I know maybe some parents will ask me, oh, I missed the boat at age 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and now I'm sitting with a 12 or 13-year-old. It's never too late. I would still think that a 12 or 13-year-old and even an older teenager can still benefit from having a talk with their parents about sex. And we'll talk about that also in a bit. So what to accomplish from birth to age 2? At this point, we work on establishing a parent-child bonding and bonding attachment that's secure and positive, and we create an atmosphere on emotional security in the home in particular. We help the child to begin to realize what it feels like to feel safe and secure about everyday things, as well as when they make big mistakes or errors that they make. Or we need to, at this age, be very particular about protecting the child from sexual abuse or distorting rumors and experiences, because this does lay unnecessary foundational work that you as a parent need to undo when you have a later conversation about sex in the future with your child. So how to talk to kids about sex from birth to age 2. So the process of talking about sex should start before kids are verbal. And this means that we incorporate the proper names for genitals into everyday activities like bath time. This might seem quite controversial, but cutesy names for genitals are okay. And maybe you do have a family history of calling, I don't know, a lady's vagina some word and a boy's penis another word, but that's okay. But that should not be the only term that your child knows. You need to incorporate the correct anatomical terms, and from an early age, penis, vagina, bum, breast, and nipples, and you shouldn't be scared to talk about these actual terms. The way that you incorporate it is, it's not that these words are universally accepted in a separate way, but it's the same as you teaching a child about an ankle, a knee, and elbow. You include the same body parts that your child would have, depending on whether they have a penis or vagina. You include that in the rest of the anatomical terms that you teach them. And it's not something that they're not going around telling people, oh, I have an elbow, I have an elbow. So don't be scared that children are going to go around and be like, oh, I have a vagina, I have a penis. If you normalize it, the same way you normalize a child having an elbow or ankle, they're not going to openly talk about it in an embarrassing way. Many parents obviously find it daunting to teach their kids the anatomically correct terms, which is a very normal feeling, but there are many reasons for teaching kids the anatomically correct terms. In case of an injury, they are able to explain where they are hurt and be casual about the anatomically correct terms as you would teach your child. Like I just mentioned, arm, ankle, thigh. It also opens up doors later for easier conversations. It would be super weird, for example, to speak to your teen son about his penis for the first time at age 13. That would just be completely uncomfortable and awkward. And your teenager would probably cringe if you now were to talk about this at age 13. So you need to think about this carefully and clearly where you start early on. So you open up and you lay the foundation for later conversations that are much more daunting and hard and difficult to talk about. Closer to age 2, you can also start to teach children where it is appropriate to touch and explore their bodies. So if you're a toddler, for example, and often small children like touching their genitals, which is perfectly normal, up to a certain age, use it as an opportunity to explain to them the meaning of privacy and what it means to keep certain things private, which is okay to teach them. And young children do understand this. You have to be careful not to make a child feel shameful about their bodies through your conversations, where they're accepted as they are, but obviously certain behaviors within reason are not accepted in a public space or with other people around. A major focus, so this is the next age, how to talk about to kids when they're 2 to 5 years old. A major focus for this particular age group is learning about boundaries and what is and isn't appropriate when it comes to touching or being touched by other people. This also lays the foundation for consent, where you have to ask, a young child can ask if they want to touch someone else. And I think it is a habit that you as a parent, for example, with their friends around for a play date, you can ask the child, is it okay if I wipe your mouth? Is it okay if I lift you up to hold you around to reach the sink to wash your hands, for example? You have to ask a child. And if you start modeling that behavior with other children, then your child will be able to see that it is okay. Lessons around sharing, touch-based games like tickling and asserting your own boundaries. For example, telling a child when it is okay to climb onto an adult's lap, all help to create a more intuitive understanding of consent. And this definitely also lays the foundation for talking about sex and talking about boundaries and all of the important pillars that we're going to come to in later years. This is still with age 2 to 5 years old. This is extremely important, but between 2 and 5 years old, you can teach children, especially if they go to a play school or they go to a nursery school or they're going to some sort of area with other children and other adults around who are caring for them or teaching them. You need to teach them that they are the boss of their bodies and they can use those exact words. You need to teach them also the difference between a safe touch, mom's hug, dad's kiss, and a bad touch, for example, if someone pinches or hits them. You also need to allow a child. So this is quite controversial, where some children or some parents insist that children need to hug and greet family members. But what you're teaching your child is they don't have power and control over their bodies. And certain children don't like hugs and kisses from anyone, not just family members. You can't force them to or impose that on them, because you're then going against them deciding for themselves whether they want a hug or kiss from a family member. And this often does end up in a lot of issues, especially when it comes to grandparents or aunts and uncles, because they find the child to be quite obstinate or rude or disrespectful. But in fact, if they don't want to hug or kiss, there's other ways to bypass it. As I use an example, you need to use like think out of the box. So a fist bump is okay, a high five is okay. So model behavior like, Auntie Fatima is here, do you want to hug Auntie Fatima or give her a high five? Both are okay. And the child can decide on an ad hoc basis in that moment whether they feel like they would like a hug or they would like a kiss, or maybe they just want to give a high five. Obviously, the actual greeting, the verbal greeting is non-negotiable, but that obviously you would set a limit with your child in that way. In the same age group, you need to establish that kids have a say over their own bodies. And this also helps with keeping them safe, exactly what I just said. While you can skip the explicit details, so you don't necessarily still talk about sex openly with them in a very concrete way for them to, because they won't understand. Now is when you should be telling your child that others should never ask or try to touch their genitals. So there shouldn't be another adult or another child who asks your child, can I please touch or see your genitals? It is also important to convey that your kids can tell you about inappropriate actions at any time, even if they've previously kept it a secret. And often this is the prime age of when children are sexually abused, even though we would not like to believe that or understand that, but it does happen, and it happens more often than we'd like to believe. At this age, it's very important to note that kids can be very curious about each other's bodies, especially if it's a boy child. He would like to see what does a girl child have. It's important to acknowledge this inquisitiveness and use it as an entry point to discuss your family's rules and values. For example, if there's a boy and girl sibling with each other, are they allowed to undress and dress in front of each other in a semi-naked or naked way? Are they allowed to shower together? Are they allowed to be in the bath together? You need to think about setting those boundaries in terms of what your family's rules and values are. You need to talk to children explicitly about when it's appropriate to be naked and who are they allowed to be naked around. And if you do catch your kids playing doctor, don't freak out. It's common. Instead, discuss how it's not appropriate to handle other people's genitals, as these are very special parts of the body that should not be touched by others. And this is also laying the groundwork and foundation for where you will have the conversation in the next phase, specifically about sex and what that involves in a child-friendly manner. At this age, this is one more slide for age 2 to 5 years old. At this age, your child might begin asking how babies are made. And the easiest and most inclusive answer is there are lots of ways. The amount of detail one goes into really depends on how much you think your child can comprehend. So depending on whether they're closer to 2 or closer to 5, or they're very mature 5, you can think about, okay, how much information am I going to share? If your child wants more information, you might try something like 2 grown-ups get their bodies together and share the sperm and egg to make a child like you, or sometimes they get the sperm or egg from someone else. So you can obviously, within reason, try and broaden it. It's fine to tell your child that some details like how sperm and egg meet will be discussed later, but be honest. And it is important not to lie and say that we will follow up later with those questions, and not just point blank refuse to talk about these things, because the child will pick up that this is their taboo subject. So I'm going to upset mom or dad and I'm not going to now talk about it. Rather leave the door open for in the future when you are able to then discuss this with them. To explore, for example, how children are made also in this age group, you can, for example, share your child's birth story. It's important to introduce kids of this age group to the idea that families and relationships can be built in different ways. So, for example, if your kids are part of or regularly around non-traditional families like single moms or dads, you should explain to kids that families are made up in different ways. There isn't always a mom and dad in a family unit. And sometimes there are kids that live with only their mom or only their dad, or they see their mom and dad alternately. You need to be able to include single moms and dads in this conversation as well. It becomes very awkward when a child then asks a child at school, but why doesn't your daddy live with you? So if you've spoken about this at home, a child is less likely to then offend their friend, for example, at school. The next age group, when they're 6 to 8 years old, this is the age that it's very important to discuss how to safely explore digital spaces, even if your child won't be using the internet unsupervised for a few more years. Establish rules around talking to strangers and sharing photos online, as well as what to do if your child comes across something that makes them feel uncomfortable. You don't need to explain or preemptively explain pornography to kids, but be prepared to have them stumble across it online. You can put all sorts of filters and all sorts of software on your phones, tablets, and computers at home. But remember, children do have access to lots of other devices in lots of other areas and spaces, and they might still stumble upon it. So rather share with them that if it makes them feel uncomfortable, often children will say, it makes me feel yucky, I don't know what to do with it. They'll come to you and they'll tell you if you've laid the foundation where they know that you are open to sharing or talking. At this age, you can also speak more explicitly to kids about sexual abuse. It is important for kids to know about this unfortunate reality, to protect themselves or to help a friend who experiences abuse, and how detailed this talk gets really depends on your child. So you start with the basics, such as how no one should be touching them without their permission, then revisiting the subject a few days later to gauge what they understood and how they feel. It's very, very important that we start talking about this, because sometimes kids will be faced with adults who do touch them inappropriately, and they need to be aware of this. If your child gets upset when talking about abuse, you may want to hit pause on this topic until they're a little older. And this might also be the time where you actually explain the actual mechanics of sex to kids. I think this is super important. There's nothing wrong with introducing this information earlier if your child seems ready for it, or delaying it a bit if you think they won't comprehend it. To make this discussion easier to incorporate, for example, you can incorporate a good book that's aimed at anticipating your child's many questions. There are many books available online. I didn't specifically put any particular one here. I think as a family, you need to think about how much detail or what kind of images you would like for your child to see, and then make a decision in terms of what you share with your child. But those cartoony drawings with all the anatomically correct labels and then the actual sort of picture of how sex actually happens is perfectly appropriate to show your child. And there are books that have this because then a child is not super curious and they don't look for answers online, because then I promise you they will be faced with porn. Talking about sex can also go hand in hand with another key topic, for example, puberty. Have a simple discussion about how bodies change as we grow. You don't need to go into lots of detail. For example, you could compare your kids' photos of when they were little and what they look like now, and ask them what has changed, what is different. Let them make some comparisons, and you can then say, as we grow up, for example, I became an adult. There were lots more changes that needed to happen. You don't have to go into lots of detail about puberty, especially with boys and girls, because that might freak them out a little bit until maybe their peers started experiencing it, or your actual child starts experiencing it. It can be quite daunting to tell a 8-year-old that, hey, listen, at some point there's going to be pubic hair, there's going to be all kinds of different changes. It's just too difficult for them to hear or understand. Just plant the seed that their bodies are going to change. How it will change, you'll obviously talk about at a later stage. Girls can expect to start puberty between 9 and 11, and a key indicator that this change is underway is the development of breast buds, which usually starts before age 10. Menstruation then follows a few years later, usually around age 12, though earlier isn't very uncommon. And boys tend to start puberty closer to 10, with pubic hair growth being the first clear sign. Once those or these changes you notice start to happen, it is exceptionally important that you actually start having the serious talk about puberty to this age group at that time when it happens, because that particular time of puberty can be very, very difficult, very disconcerting, and children feel very isolated and lonely, questioning what is going on with their bodies and why are these changes happening. When it comes to discussing puberty, you can also share a good book with your child. It can walk you both through puberty's more technical aspects, such as the differences between testosterone, estrogen, and why and how bodies undergo changes in hair, genitals, voices, etc. Make this a general talk, as kids should learn about both sexes' puberty processes. I do feel it's important for boys to also learn about girls' puberty changes and vice versa, because obviously we don't want them to start Googling this information, and that might also send them down or basically expose your children to porn. The detailed mechanics of puberty might be limited to one conversation, but the impact of this transition should be an ongoing discussion that you have with your child as they, for example, are going through these weird changes in stages. You can, for example, say, it does feel weird. It is difficult. Yes, boys might have all kinds of different things happening to their bodies. Be open and be honest. And if you don't know, ask someone for help, but definitely keep the door open with your teens at this age, as it is exceptionally important, and the changes they go through can be quite jarring. From ages 9 to 12, this is where you should start talking about sexism and sexualization. Use examples found in the media or even in your own community in terms of how we are maybe over-sexualized or we over-sexualize females in particular. This age is also full of emotional and social changes, and girls in particular may struggle with body issues. Parents should also regularly check in with their children about how they're feeling and what they're wondering about. And this age, it's really just emphasizing over and over again that it's normal what's going on with their bodies at this age. Between 9 and 12 years old, this age group I find generally has more freedom online. So it's a very good idea to periodically check about internet safety and to build on your already established digital rules and values as in your family. Talk frankly about how sharing nude or sexually explicit photos of themselves or their peers may be illegal. Explain the longevity of an online footprint. Things don't disappear online. It's there forever. And your future employer will find your online footprint and find that photo that you sent many, many moons ago. So I think it's important to teach your child about the reality of using social media. We don't encourage them not to use it, but use it in a safe, healthy way. For example, with children who share naked selfies with each other on WhatsApp groups or on social media, Please know and explain to your children that they could be charged with making or distributing child pornography, even if everyone involved is okay with it. And I think it is very, very important to explain this to children. Explain to your child that there are other ways to feel good about themselves rather than posting themselves online for likes. And ask your child, what do you think it means to be respectful on social media? And when high-profile stories on sexting or online bullying are in the news, use them as jumping off points to ask your child how they would handle similar situations, which are very important discussions to have as well. How to talk to your teenager about sex. So this is where talking with your kids about sex and sexuality early in life really, really pays off once your child is now hit their teens. All of this talk with teaching them the anatomically correct terms, using the word penis, using the word vagina, explaining about puberty, having them hit puberty now. You've established yourself open about talking about all of these topics. Your kids are probably going to feel much more comfortable talking to you and asking questions. But if you've been quiet on the subject of sex until now, I recommend sitting down with your teen and stating that you're changing your ways, and this will reassure your teen. It's exceptionally important that your teenager feels like the questions they have are not silly, and they're not going to resort to Google searches. They're not going to ask their peers about it. They should come to you, and they should be open in asking any question that they have in terms of how babies are made, what are the mechanics around sex. All of these things should be openly discussed with your child, because you then control the information in terms of what you're sharing with your child. Maybe it was not something that was easily done with you, or maybe it was never done with you when you were at that age. Remember that the kind of exposure our children have these days, we have to control the information and what they actually see. So this is super, super important to have a very open, frank discussion with your teenager. But remember, it will be super weird if you've never spoken about it before. So that makes it very uncomfortable and very awkward, because you've shied away from this topic for such a long time. While you generally want to minimize the lecturing and lectures, teens need real talk about the dangers of online, the online presence, peer pressure, consent. Is it okay to be dating someone? And this is all based on your family values. You need to think about, as a Muslim, as a young Muslim in a particular school, socializing with other religions and cultures, what is okay and what is not okay for your child. You need to make the rule for your child around this and have an open discussion with him in terms of what they understand. It's also important to frequently discuss consent in sexual relationships at this age, because you don't want your child to become an entitled, irresponsible partner later in life. You need to be also thinking about how to help teens protect themselves against peer pressure and sexual violence, adding that conversations around these topics should include the impact of drinking and drugs that can have on judgment, especially in the kind of world we live in. We like to believe that our children are very protected, but these are definite dangers that, yes, Muslim teenagers are involved in, which we need to think about and be real with them. This is where you need to be real and open and lay down your family values and beliefs in terms of what you expect from your teenager. You need to have frequent conversations around healthy relationships. So if your child is reluctant to talk about themselves, talk about friends, or make up some sort of hypothetical scenario that you talk about, you may also want to share relationship stories from your past with your child. Ultimately, when it comes to teens, you want to empower your child to be able to evaluate risks and make good decisions. You're not going to always be with them. You're not always going to be able to check up on them. But if you lay down a good foundation for them, and they have a good moral compass that you've instilled in them, it always helps them make a better decision when they are faced with a tricky or difficult scenario. Help kids, or especially teenagers, understand that they have a gut, they have an inner voice, and they can and they should listen to it. It's a big part of what sex education is about, and discussing the right topics at the right ages. You're setting yourself, or you're setting your child up to make these good decisions when they're faced with very difficult dilemmas later on in life. How to appropriately respond to your child's questions. Be honest, be open, and be available without making the child feel embarrassed or ashamed. If you do not know, let them know honestly. Be invested in your child's thoughts, questions, and comments, and be genuine about this. Children have an easier time accepting parents' thoughts and ideas when they feel understood, they feel heard, and they feel valued. How properly addressing sex will impact children and provide a balanced understanding. So this is where I feel our research really does help in terms of why we need to start early and why we need to build on this throughout a child's life. So children have shown, research has shown that parents who talk about sex to their children from a young age are less likely to explore and experiment with sexual topics online as well as with their peers. Be confident that you would rather control the information that your child hears instead of a distorted view of sex through pornography, which is what your child will find online. There is no real good sex book for teenagers that first pops up when your child types into the Google search bar, what is sex? It will always be porn first. Sexual relationships should also be governed by your own family values, beliefs, and religious principles, but do not make the topic of sex a taboo subject. So still be open to discussing this in the privacy of your home, in confidence with your child, because I do think otherwise they will be looking for information online. Many teens who are addicted to porn say that they stumbled upon it out of curiosity and by accident without seeking it out. This is research-based. A teen's view of sex becomes distorted and is not realistic once they have been exposed to pornography. They will then have unrealistic expectations in future with romantic sexual relationships, which is very difficult to resolve later in life. So it's easier to have a well-adjusted adult that a teen has not been exposed to pornography earlier on and have a healthy relationship in the future. Some of the commonly asked questions which I'll go through, and yes, I do have a section at the end with questions that I will open the floor. I'll just go through some of them. So what if I find my child playing doctors with friends? Try to stay calm in the knowledge that this behavior is perfectly normal. Young children are curious about their bodies and the bodies of others. Young children also commonly engage in games where they show each other their genitals. Where there is no difference in power between children, this is the test. The motivation is general curiosity and part of normal play. And this is where you as an adult need to redirect the children in their play. But remember, if you were happy to share with your child a photo about what a girl body looks like or what a boy body looks like, depending on the terms you want to use based on your family and values, your family's values, they generally would not then seek out for example, a person of the opposite sex to look at their genitalia. So this is where you can prevent it. But if it does happen, it is perfectly normal. And lots of young kids like to see they're just curious. So there's no over-sexualization, or it's not sexualized in the way that we as adults would like to think or believe. It's there's no difference in power between the children. They're not an older child. They are almost equal age. That's perfectly normal and acceptable. And remember, your reaction will lay the foundation for what your child internalizes in terms of whether this is a taboo subject or whether this is something that is accepted and normal and it's just my body that I'm curious about. Another question that I often get asked is, why is it so hard to talk to your own kids about sex? It is so hard because, it's so hard that a shocking number of parents never talk about sex to their kids. And there's three main reasons, I think. The embarrassment that you as a parent recalls about the subject in your own conscious and unconscious inhibitions. Your lack of a plan, agenda, or a clear idea of what you ought to say. In this, I hope this presentation helps guide you in a little bit to start the conversation. Once this conversation has begun with your children and you feel comfortable, genuinely comfortable, it's very easy to build on that. And your own ambiguity, so parents' own ambiguity about what they themselves believe about sex and what they want their children to believe. That's why at the beginning of this presentation, I asked you to have a long, hard think and conversation, either with your spouse or just with yourself, to think about what is it that I actually believe about sex. And from there, you need to then convey that message with your family values and beliefs to your child. This one is quite difficult, but can a parent compete with media or peers as an influence in how kids think about sex? Yes, I believe yes. A parent who starts early and knows what he or she is doing can be the dominant influence, superseding and overwhelming all other voices. I found this sort of quote where someone asked, especially in regard to this question, what is really going on in the world, I had a typo there, can best be described as, the world we've made is harshly different from the one we once knew. This culture didn't develop from that one, it mutated. These are raw, cruder, colder times, and sexual promiscuity has become a knife edge that would have stunned us. Sex has flooded our children. So we have to be the people who control the information in terms of what our children hear, so we can control that and have input in terms of what our children absorb, believe, feel, and what they do later on in life at some point based on what we have taught them and invested in them. Is it okay for children to play with their genitals, especially young children? Yes, where there is no difference in power between children, it's generally it's just curiosity and motivation. If you wish and they play with their genitals, you can gently distract or redirect the children in their play. And at a later stage, respond to your child's desire to know more about bodies by looking at suitable books or websites together. And this is just where they're curious. Does talking with my child about sex have to be uncomfortable and embarrassing for both of us? No. Quite the contrary. If you build up the information and the talks over the years as described in this presentation, the talk can be a bonding experience with your child. It has the ability to strengthen a firm bond between you and your child that facilitates other kinds of communication and trust, where your child will know that there is no taboo subject. It doesn't matter what wrong I did. It doesn't matter how I messed up. I am always able to talk to mom or dad, because we even speak about things like sex, and mom and dad are open to answering my questions, being genuine about it. They make me feel comfortable. They don't make it feel like it's weird or awkward. And I think these are important bonding experiences. Is it harder for a single parent to talk to kids about sex? Yes and no. So it may be harder in the sense that you're on your own with no spouse to support you in the discussion, but the objectives and principles are the same. So in a way, it is easier because you have control and consistency in the message being shared with how and what you say. Single parents, I feel, sometimes take the responsibility more seriously and do a better job because the responsibility lies solely with them. When there is a couple involved, the one part of the couple will feel no, the other person will take over, and that person will feel no, like the other person should have taken the lead between either mom or dad. So I feel like in that couple relationship, sometimes they miss the boat because maybe there has been a very heavy reliance on a single person only, and maybe that makes it more difficult to talk about. Is it okay for young children to play with and see their genitals? Yes, I answered this question in a way. I said, yes, it is normal and age appropriate. Young children are explorers by nature, and teaching them that it is okay to see their genitals, but it should only be done in the privacy of a bathroom or bedroom. And this is obviously not something that they're obsessed about. There should be no shame translated to a young child about wanting to see their genitals and private parts. And young children are often curious about lots of things, and it is normal for them to want to see their genitals. Lastly, what is the most important thing when talking to kids about sex? And I feel like I want to leave you with this, is the single most important thing is to make it positive and something that is exciting, but exciting in terms of having a family through marriage in a joyful and respectful manner. You can also add in the subject of love, marriage, commitment, and joy into this topic in an age-appropriate manner with kids. And this is where, for example, when a child is 18 years old, a child is allowed to drive. The same sort of principle can be used when you get married. You're allowed to have sex if you're coming from an Islamic background. And I think that is in something that you can instill in children in an early on age, that is something that is normalized. Because remember, we are bombarded in a culture where it's very normal to have premarital sex and date when you are teenagers or when you are at university. And your children will be in those environments. You can't protect them, and they need to make good decisions at that point. Based on what you have invested in them and what you have taught them. There's some references and sources. Remember, I will share all of this with you. Question and comment time. I think there are some questions in the chat. If I can go look and see.
Navita, would you like me to read out the questions for you, or would you read it yourself?
Yes, you can read it to me and I'll answer, try my best. Go ahead.
Okay, so the first question we have is, how do you talk to a child who's been sexually abused about sex and body development? So when it comes to sexual abuse, and I didn't include that in particular, remember that the first thing as a psychologist, I would feel that a child would need to be seen by a professional counselor, psychologist, social worker to deal with the trauma of the sexual abuse firstly. Secondly, remember that their first experience of sex has now been distorted or tainted. So you need to obviously think of being very empathetic and starting very, very small baby steps to try and normalize and change that perception that's not so distorted. It is very, very unfortunate when you see a young child who has been sexually abused,
but it's also much more important to now try and normalize their perception of sex because their first encounter was so negative. So I do think, yes, the way that you talk about them is similar to how I explained, but you'll have to just make small baby steps not to re-traumatize them, but a professional will be able to guide you and help you in that regard.
Thank you, Nabila. Another question. Can I discuss sex with my 8-year-old girl and 10-year-old boy together?
If this is the first time you are discussing sex with an 8-year-old or 10-year-old, no. You need to discuss the foundational things of what I explained from birth to 2, from 2 to 5, and 5 to 8, individually with the 8-year-old girl and 10-year-old boy. And then once you have those foundational sort of things in place, it's okay, but it's not advisable. I would always say that if there's lots of siblings in a home, a mom or dad need to take the lead with each individual child in turns to make it clearer for children to understand, because the 8-year-old girl might be quite embarrassed to hear about the boy's question and they might not feel super comfortable. So no, I would say not together, separate.
Thank you, Nabila. We have an anonymous question. What's the view on brothers aged 10 and younger seeing their baby sister's private parts when changing nappies?
When there's a 10-year-old and you said they're younger, if I heard the question correctly, so they're 10-year-old boys and they're younger, I think that's correct, and they have a baby sister, it's okay to explain to them that a girl child has different genitalia. I would think that it's not 100% okay to be showing the child specifically the baby sister's obviously vagina or whatever while you're changing the diaper, but make them aware that it's different and maybe start off, especially with children that age, with a picture. So a picture is okay to show them. And if they're then curious and they're around as they get older in a more respectful way, you can say that, because I also think you can't set a precedent with children to say it's okay to look at your sister's genitalia and it's not okay for the sister to see the brother's genitalia. We have Sharam and Haya in Islam, so you have to show them a picture, but not necessarily the child's genitalia in particular.
Thank you, Nabila. We have another question. With LGBTQ and sexual orientation, should one bring up the topic and make the child aware of such things, whereas before they had no clue about it?
I would say by the time they hit 10 years old, for sure, you need to expose them about the LGBTQ and what is very normalized and has become very common. So if you think and you switch on your TV, there's tons of programs all over Netflix, DSTV, Disney Plus, where it's very normalized to see lesbians, gay couples. It's common. They will be exposed to it at school and in our society. I think you have to make them aware of it. I didn't include that particular kind of thing in this presentation because I think a lot of children are struggling with understanding. And I think that's another whole separate discussion because there's just so much information. But I do think making them aware of it. And remember, this goes hand in hand with family values and beliefs and what you as a family believes in terms of what your idea is around gay couples, lesbian couples, queer people, all of these sorts of people who identify in this way. You need to make it clear as a family where you stand with your kids in this regard.
Thank you, Nabila. We don't have any other questions. Would you like to conclude here?
Sure. Let me just have a look. Yes, I see that's all of it. I think in conclusion, the reason why I kept it short and succinct and I will share the slides with Masood and Masood can share that openly. I'll share it in PDF form, is I wanted to start this discussion as just a starting point where we can then build up for example, we can then talk about how to deal with when a child does see pornography, what's our reaction and how we talk about it. So there's lots of breakaway topics that we can build on this. I think you need to, or as parents, everyone needs to just take a few days, think about what you would like your child to know and start and begin that conversation without feeling that they're going to learn this at school, or if they're curious enough, they will ask me. They might not. They might go to Google first. They might go to their peers. So my message and my final message is, feel like you can control the information with your children. Don't be ashamed of feeling like you're out of your depth. You can maybe be honest and say, well, I'm not very comfortable talking about this, but it's important to talk about. And I think children do value and appreciate that kind of honesty. So take the leap, parents. I see lots of kids who have not been exposed to this very, very important topic, and they're left with lots of questions and lots of curiosity. And believe me, children who are so curious will use the internet to find the answers. And I would hate for them to find the answers online. I would prefer that the first point of call is parents who discuss this in a safe, confidential, private way in the family home.
Thank you once again, Nabila, for the outstanding presentation and for empowering us with knowledge on this topic and for helping us as parents recognize the importance of being proactive, brave, and responsible parents. We thank you again for empowering us, and we wish to have you again. Thank you.
Shukran. Jazakallah khair for having me, and it was really nice to share this. Inshallah, we'll chat again.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.